It was 1899 and the roads of New York City looked nothing like they do today. Horses pulled carriages through streets covered in mud and cobblestones. Pedestrians walked wherever they pleased. And somewhere in that chaos, a handful of strange, smoke-belching machines were beginning to appear. Machines that moved on their own power, frightened every horse within earshot, and were operated by people who had never been tested, trained, licensed, or asked to follow a single rule of the road. Because in 1899, and for years afterward, there were no rules, no driver's licenses, no driving tests, no speed limits, no stop signs, no traffic lights, and no minimum age to get behind the wheel. No requirement to register your vehicle. If you had a car and you could start the engine, you could drive it anywhere you wanted, as fast as you wanted, at any age you wanted. And nobody could stop you, because no law said otherwise. So how did America go from a country where a 12-year-old could legally pilot a 1-ton gasoline-powered machine through a crowd of pedestrians to the system of licenses, tests, and regulations that exists today? That is a stranger story than you might expect, and it took far longer than it should have. The automobile did not arrive in America with a plan. It arrived as a curiosity. Carl Benz patented what is generally considered the first modern automobile in 1886 in Mannheim, Germany. Within a decade, tinkerers, engineers, and wealthy hobbyists across Europe and the United States were building their own versions. Many of these early machines were essentially modified horse carriages with small engines bolted to the frame. They were unreliable, difficult to start, prone to breakdowns, and required constant mechanical attention. The Doria brothers, Charles and Frank, built the first successful American gasoline car in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1893 and won the first American automobile race 2 years later in Chicago, covering a 54-mile course at an average speed of about 7 miles per hour. Ransom Olds opened one of the first automobile factories in Detroit in 1897, and by 1901 his curved-dash Oldsmobile became the first mass-produced American car, selling over 600 units in its first year. By the turn of the century, a small but growing number of these machines were appearing on American roads, and the people who encountered them for the first time had absolutely no framework for understanding what they were looking at or how to share a road with them. But roads is a generous word for what existed at the time. Outside of a few major cities, American roads were unpaved dirt paths originally laid out for horses, wagons, and foot traffic. They turned to impassable mud in the rain and blinding dust clouds in the summer. Ruts carved by wagon wheels could swallow an automobile tire and snap an axle. There were no lane markings, no center lines, no road signs, and no shoulders. Most roads had no drainage, so water pooled in low spots and created hazards that drivers could not see until they were already stuck. In cities, the streets were marginally better, paved with cobblestones or bricks, but they were shared by a staggering variety of users. Horses and wagons carried commercial goods. Pushcart vendors sold food and merchandise from the curb. Streetcars ran on iron rails embedded in the road surface. Bicycles wove between slower traffic. Children played in the street because there were no parks or playgrounds in most working-class neighborhoods. Stray dogs wandered freely. And now, occasionally, a noisy machine that smelled like kerosene and moved at speeds horses could not match was threading through all of it, operated by someone who may have been behind the wheel for the first time that morning. The early automobile owners were almost exclusively wealthy. A car in the late 1890s could cost over $1,000, at a time when the average American worker earned roughly $400 a year. Owning a car was a status symbol, an expensive hobby for industrialists, doctors, and the leisure class. Early automobile clubs sprang up in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, where wealthy members gathered to compare their machines and organize touring excursions on country roads. The American Automobile Association was founded in 1902 in Chicago, originally as a social organization for car enthusiasts who wanted to promote better roads and organize races, and because there were so few of these machines, nobody saw the need to regulate them. Horse-drawn carriages had never required a license. Bicycles had never required a license. Why would these horseless carriages be any different? The answer to that question would become painfully obvious within a few years, but in the beginning, the automobile existed in a regulatory vacuum that nobody was in a hurry to fill. The conflict between cars and horses made the situation worse. Horses were terrified of automobiles. The noise, the smell, the unpredictable movements of these machines caused horses to bolt, rear, and throw their riders with alarming regularity. Farmers and teamsters whose livelihoods depended on horses began to despise the automobile and the wealthy people who drove them. In some rural areas, angry farmers strung wire across roads to disable passing cars. City residents complained that automobiles kicked up clouds of dust on unpaved streets, ruined the quiet of residential neighborhoods, and endangered children playing in the road. That logic, that cars were a rich man's nuisance that would eventually go away, held for a remarkably long time, even as the number of cars on the road grew and the chaos they caused became impossible to ignore. The first recorded automobile collision in the United States happened on May 30th, 1896, in New York City. A man named Henry Wells, driving a Duryea motor wagon at roughly 8 miles per hour, struck a bicyclist named Evelyn Thomas, who suffered a broken leg. The incident made the newspapers across the city and prompted a brief flurry of concern about these new machines. It was the first time many New Yorkers had thought about the question of what happens when an automobile and a person occupy the same space at the same time. New York officials responded by requiring drivers to mark their cars with their initials painted in black over a white background. That was the extent of the regulation. No license, no test, just your initials on the side of the car so people would know who to blame. Within 3 years, the collisions became more frequent and more serious. By 1901, newspapers in major cities were running regular accounts of automobile accidents, and a growing chorus of voices was calling for some kind of government intervention. But the automobile lobby, small as it was, argued that regulation would stifle innovation, and most legislators agreed that the problem was not serious enough to warrant action. After all, horses caused accidents too. Why single out the automobile? The situation in those early years was genuinely absurd by modern standards. America did not get its first stop sign until 1915, when Michigan installed one. Cleveland installed the first electric traffic signal in 1914. Before that, there were no painted lane markings, no speed limit signs, and no one-way streets anywhere in the country. Intersections were a free-for-all where cars, horses, bicycles, and pedestrians converged from every direction and negotiated passage through a combination of shouting, horn-honking, and luck. Some local governments tried creative solutions to manage the chaos, solutions that now sound like something out of a comedy sketch. Vermont passed a law in 1894 requiring a person to walk ahead of any automobile, waving a red flag to warn pedestrians and horses of the approaching machine. The idea was borrowed from Britain's Locomotive Acts, which had imposed similar requirements on steam-powered vehicles since 1865. In Britain, the flag bearer had to walk at least 60 yards ahead of the vehicle, effectively limiting the car to the walking speed of the person in front of it. Pennsylvania had an even more spectacular requirement. According to contemporary accounts, a proposed Pennsylvania law would have required drivers to send up a signal rocket at every mile marker to warn the surrounding countryside that a car was approaching. Whether this particular provision was actually enforced is debatable, but the fact that legislators considered it tells you something about how terrified rural communities were of these machines. Farmers who had spent their entire lives working with horses suddenly found their animals bolting at the sound and sight of automobiles. A runaway horse pulling a loaded wagon through a crowded street was not just an inconvenience, it was a genuine emergency. And from the farmer's perspective, the automobile owners who caused these incidents were wealthy city people who had no respect for the working people whose livelihoods depended on calm, reliable horses. Some towns tried to ban automobiles outright. Local ordinances in rural communities across the country prohibited cars from using certain roads, limited their hours of operation, or required drivers to pull over and shut off their engines whenever a horse-drawn vehicle approached. These bans were rarely effective because automobile owners had money, political connections, and a growing conviction that the future belonged to the machine, not the horse. Connecticut became the first state to pass an actual speed limit in 1901, capping cars at 12 miles per hour in cities and 15 miles per hour on country roads. The limits sound comically low today, but most cars at the time could barely exceed those speeds anyway. There were only about 4,200 automobiles on all American roads at the time, which meant that for every car on the road there were thousands of horses. The automobile was still a rarity, a spectacle that drew crowds when one appeared on a rural road. The same year, New York became the first state to require automobile registration, meaning owners had to provide their names, addresses, and a description of their vehicles to the state. But registration was about tracking who owned the cars, not about who was allowed to drive them. An owner could register a vehicle and immediately hand the keys to anyone of any age with any level of experience, and that person could drive it legally. There was still no licensing requirement anywhere in the country. The gap between vehicle registration and driver licensing would persist for years, a distinction that seems obvious today but took decades to close. In 1899, Chicago had become the first city to require automobile drivers to pass some kind of examination before operating a car. New York City had a separate rule that required operators of steam-powered vehicles to be licensed engineers, since steam cars ran on boilers that could explode if handled by someone who did not understand the technology. But these were local, patchwork regulations that varied wildly from city to city and were almost impossible to enforce. A driver could comply with the rules in one city, cross the city limits, and find himself in a jurisdiction with completely different requirements or none at all. The first real driver's license laws came in 1903, when Massachusetts and Missouri became the first states to require drivers to obtain a license before operating a motor vehicle. The word license, though, deserves an asterisk the size of a billboard. There was no test of any kind, no driving exam, no written exam, no vision screening, and no demonstration of any skill whatsoever. You walked into a government office, you filled out a form with your name and address, you paid a small fee, and you received a piece of paper that said you were allowed to drive. It was, in every meaningful sense, an identification card. Massachusetts also became the first state to issue official license plates that same year on September 1, 1903. Frederick Tudor, a wealthy car enthusiast from Brookline and nephew of Boston Symphony Orchestra founder Henry Lee Higginson, received Massachusetts license plate number 1. Tudor had been working with the State Highway Commission and persuaded the newly created State Automobile Department to introduce mandatory state-issued plates. The plates were blue porcelain with white numbers and the words Mass Automobile Register across the top. By the end of 1903, 3,241 cars and 502 motorcycles had been registered in Massachusetts. But the fact that Massachusetts and Missouri now required licenses did not mean the rest of the country followed. Far from it. The adoption of driver's licensing across the United States was one of the slowest regulatory rollouts in American history. Most states saw no urgency. Cars were still relatively rare outside of the Northeast and the upper Midwest. Rural legislators argued that farmers needed no license to drive a wagon and should need none to drive a car. The automobile industry, growing rapidly and gaining political influence, lobbied against regulations that might discourage people from buying cars. And a general philosophy of the era, rooted in frontier individualism and deep suspicion of government authority, leaned heavily toward personal freedom and against interference in private matters. If a man wanted to buy a car and drive it, that was his business and his risk, and the government had no right to tell him he needed its permission to travel on a public road. The result was a country where licensing existed in 2 states and nowhere else. You could get a license in Boston, drive across the state line to New York, and find that the state you had just entered had no licensing law of any kind. Meanwhile, cars were getting faster, roads were getting more crowded, and the consequences of having millions of untrained, unlicensed drivers operating increasingly fast machines on streets designed for horses were becoming harder to deny with each passing year. If you're finding this valuable and want to see more deep dives into the hidden stories that shaped America, hit that subscribe button. We cover the history behind the systems and institutions you deal with every single day. Now, back to the chaos on the roads. In 1908, 2 things happened that transformed the automobile from a rich man's toy into a national transportation crisis. Henry Ford launched the Model T, and Rhode Island became the first state to require both a driver's license and a driving exam. The Model T changed everything. When it debuted, it cost $850, still a significant sum but within reach of a successful farmer, a small business owner, or a skilled tradesman who saved carefully. By 1912, Ford's moving assembly line at the Highland Park plant had cut production time from over 12 hours per car to about 93 minutes. By 1916, the price had dropped to $360, roughly the equivalent of 6 months' wages for an average factory worker. By 1924, you could buy a Model T for $260, less than the cost of a good horse and buggy. For the first time, middle-class Americans could afford a car, and they bought them by the hundreds of thousands, then by the millions. In 1909, there were 200,000 automobiles on American roads. By 1916, that number had exploded to 2.25 million. 7 years later, in 1923, there were over 15 million registered automobiles in the United States. The country had gone from a handful of wealthy hobbyists puttering around on dirt roads to millions of untrained drivers competing for space on streets that had been designed for horse traffic. The roads were not ready for that many vehicles. The The laws had not caught up to the technology, and the cities had no infrastructure to manage the chaos, and the drivers were absolutely not ready. The vast majority of the millions of people buying Model Ts had never driven anything in their lives. There was no standardized training and almost no driving schools in any meaningful number. Most new drivers learned from the salesman who sold them the car, from a friend or family member who already owned one, or through pure trial and error on public roads. The error part was the problem. Accidents surged across the country as the number of untrained drivers multiplied. In the summer of 1908, Detroit alone saw 31 people struck by automobiles in just 2 months, and that was in a single city. The numbers climbed every year as more cars hit the road. City streets became genuinely dangerous places. Pedestrians who had walked freely in the road for their entire lives, who had grown up in a world where the fastest thing on the street was a trotting horse, were suddenly sharing that space with machines that weighed a ton or more and were driven by people who had never taken a single lesson. The response from most city and state governments was agonizingly slow, often arriving years after the problem had become impossible to ignore. Detroit, the city that was building the cars, became the first city to innovate its way out of the crisis. Detroit installed the first concrete road center line in the country. It introduced the first stop sign designs. It pioneered one-way streets. It installed some of the earliest standardized traffic signals. A Detroit police officer named William Potts built the first four-way, three-color traffic signal in 1920, using red, amber, and green railroad signal lights wired to a timer. The city essentially invented modern traffic engineering out of desperate necessity because the cars it was producing were overwhelming the streets it had built. Other cities followed Detroit's lead, but slowly. Cleveland installed the first electric traffic signal in 1914, a simple two-color system with red and green lights operated by a police officer sitting in a booth nearby. Los Angeles became one of the first cities to install automatic traffic signals in the early 1920s. The first center line painted on an American road is generally credited to Edward Hines, the chairman of the Wayne County Road Commission in Michigan, who reportedly got the idea around 1911 after watching a leaking milk wagon leave a white trail down the middle of a road. Before that innovation, drivers simply drove wherever they wanted on the road, guessing which side to use based on what the approaching driver seemed to be doing. The concept of "stay to the right" existed as a general custom, but was not codified into law in most places, and many drivers simply ignored it. Pennsylvania set the first minimum driving age in 1909, requiring drivers to be at least 18 years old. Before that, in every state without such a law, there was literally no age restriction. If a child could reach the pedals and turn the crank to start the engine, that child could drive on public roads, and many did. Farm families in particular relied on teenagers and even younger children to operate vehicles for daily tasks. New Jersey became the first state to require both a written examination and a road test in 1913. The written test covered basic knowledge of traffic rules, and the road test required the applicant to demonstrate that they could actually operate the vehicle without endangering themselves or others. This was a genuine innovation in the history of American driving regulation. For the first time, a state government was saying that driving a car required demonstrable knowledge and skill, not just enough money for a registration fee. But New Jersey was an outlier for years. Most states that had licensing requirements at all still issued licenses with no test of any kind. You paid your fee and you got your card. The automobile industry itself was divided on the question of licensing. Some manufacturers, particularly those making more expensive cars, supported licensing because they believed it would improve the reputation of automobiles and encourage more cautious driving. Others opposed any form of regulation as government overreach that would discourage potential customers from buying cars. The industry's political influence was growing rapidly, and in many states, automobile manufacturers and dealers associations successfully lobbied to delay or weaken licensing requirements. By the mid-1920s, the automobile had become central to American life in a way that nobody in 1899 could have predicted. Cars were no longer luxury items. They were how Americans got to work, bought groceries, visited family, and explored the country. The automobile industry had become one of the largest economic forces in the nation. Gas stations, repair shops, tire companies, and roadside motels had sprung up to serve the growing population of drivers. The federal government began funding highway construction through the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921, but the patchwork of state driving laws remained wildly inconsistent, and the inconsistency itself was becoming dangerous. Some states required licenses while others did not. Some states required tests, but most still did not. Speed limits varied from state to state, and sometimes from county to county within the same state. A driver could cross a state line and find that every rule had changed, or discover that the state he had just entered had no rules at all. A licensed driver from New Jersey who had passed both a written exam and a road test could share a highway with an unlicensed 12-year-old from a neighboring state, and both of them were operating within the law. In 1926, the Second National Conference on Street and Highway Safety, organized by Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, issued the Uniform Vehicle Code. The code was an ambitious attempt to standardize the chaos. It included a recommended minimum driving age of 16, requirements for driver's licenses, standardized rules of the road, and guidelines for traffic signs and signals. It represented the first serious effort to create a national framework for how Americans drove. But the Uniform Vehicle Code was a recommendation, not a mandate. The federal government had no authority to require states to adopt it. States were free to follow it, modify it, or ignore it entirely, and many chose to ignore it. As late as 1935, 9 years after the Uniform Vehicle Code was published, only 39 out of 48 states required a driver's license at all. The remaining 9 states still allowed anyone, of any age, to drive a car on public roads without any form of government authorization. And among the 39 states that did require licenses, many still issued them without any examination. As late as the 1940s, some states simply mailed you a license in exchange for a 25 or 50-cent fee, no questions asked. South Dakota was the last state to mandate driving exams, long after every other state had accepted that some minimum standard of competence was necessary before turning a person loose on public roads with a machine that weighed more than a ton. The story of the driver's license is not a story about a single law or a single moment. It is a story about a technology that arrived faster than the institutions meant to govern it. The automobile went from a curiosity in 1893 to 200,000 vehicles in 1909 to 15 million in 1923. Each of those cars was operated by a person who may or may not have had any training, any license, or any understanding of the rules of the road, because in many places the rules simply did not exist yet. The system that governs driving today, the one with written tests, road tests, age restrictions, graduated licensing programs, point systems, mandatory insurance, and photo identification, was built piece by piece over more than half a century, state by state, crisis by crisis, accident by accident. Every regulation that exists today is the product of some earlier period when that regulation did not exist, and the consequences were obvious to everyone except the people with the power to change it. The same pattern repeated itself with every new rule. Someone argued that the regulation was unnecessary government overreach, that the free market would sort things out, that individual freedom was more important than collective safety. And eventually, the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore, and the rule was adopted, often decades after it should have been. And perhaps the most revealing detail in this entire story belongs to the man who did more than anyone else to put cars on American roads. Henry Ford launched the Model T in 1908. He built millions of them. He transformed American transportation forever. But his home state of Michigan did not start issuing driver's licenses until 1919. Henry Ford received his first driver's license that year at the age of 56. The man who built the car that changed the world drove it for over a decade without a license, because the law did not require one. The next time you wait in line at the DMV, frustrated by the paperwork and the eye test and the three-point turn, remember that the entire system you are standing inside was built from scratch because the country once let anyone, of any age, drive anything, anywhere, with no permission, no training, and no rules. That line at the DMV is the alternative to what came before it. And what came before it was a 12-year-old behind the wheel of a Model T, sharing a road with a horse, a bicycle, and a pedestrian at an intersection with no stop sign, no traffic light, and no speed limit in a country that had not yet figured out which side of the road you were supposed to drive on.